This morning we're going to talk about David and Goliath. If you can look at the Bible, turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17. If you're driving in your car, don't do that, just listen to me, and we'll share some wonderful thoughts about this incident. This week we're talking about David, who was a shepherd boy and became king of Israel. We're talking about him because he's a fascinating character, and we're talking about him because there's something we can learn from him. He was a man chosen by God. Today we turn to 1 Samuel 17, and we find that he went to the scene of a battle. And I want to describe it to you. The Israelites were against the Philistines, which they continually seem to be. The Philistines lived along the Mediterranean Sea, slightly to the west and south of Jerusalem, and continually they marauded into the lands of the Israelites. And we find that they had a giant of a man. Let me just read the description. His name was Goliath. And in verse 7 of that chapter it says, "His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and his iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield-bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks." He was tall. It says in verse 4, he was a Philistine over 9 feet tall, and he had a bronze helmet, and wore a coat of scales of armor and bronze, weighing 500 shekels. He was an enormous man. Can you imagine him? 9 feet tall, plus this high helmet, and there he was, and he was shouting a challenge. Let me read it to you. This is what he said, verse 8. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." You see, this is the way things worked in those days. You chose one man for your nation, he became the champion, and he fought for you. I'm not sure if that wouldn't be a good scheme today in war, and leave the rest of us out of it. But the philosophy behind it was very simple. You challenge, and you challenged for your nation. And this is exactly what Goliath did. But there's something else. When you challenged the Israelites, you challenged the living God, because he'd chosen that particular nation. David came to this battle scene, and he came to visit his brothers. The Bible tells us that he brought bread and cheese from Dad. And he really came not just to bring the bread and cheese, but to find out what was going on and then report back home. And he happened to hear Goliath's challenge. Look with me at verse 23. "And as David was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it." And I want you to know David was a little bit upset, and he soon said so. In fact, he was filled with horror and disgust at what was going on. Look at verse 26. "And David asked the men standing near, 'What will be done for the man who kills the Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?'" You see, David knew that this man was not defying the Israelites. He was defying God. And it was about time someone took care of him. Now, if you think about it, 9 feet tall plus helmet, no one was too keen to do it. But David was. The only thing, his elder brother was more than a little upset with him. Let me read to you verse 28. "When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him. 'Why do you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the desert? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down here to watch the battle.' What's wrong with you? What's your problem?" Well, you know how older brothers are. They always get upset when young ones come and push their noses in. But it didn't seem to deter David. And someone took David to King Saul. I want you to see some contrasts It's quite fascinating between David and the king. On the one hand, David was a man of faith. Saul had become very human, and in many ways his faith had faded. First of all, we find that David declares faith in verse 34 and 35. David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck him, rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it and killed it." So he had some qualifications. Verse 33 shows us something of Saul. Saul replied, "You're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a boy, and he's been fighting men from his youth." That didn't faze David either. Secondly, David wasn't pleased by Goliath's appearance. You see, David had the eye of faith. Listen to verse 46. "Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be one like them, because he's defied the armies of the living God." You see, he was still disgusted at this challenge, and he still wanted to deal with this giant of a man. But you see, Saul doubted David against Goliath, and you can't really blame him, because he's simply being very human. And then there's something else about David. David always traveled with God. And interestingly, God always traveled with David. Verse 37, Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." He needn't have been concerned, because David knew perfectly well that's what God would do. And Saul's faith in the living God had really become absent. And so off went David, and the Lord went with him. And he went off to deal with this Philistine. Now picture this. I wonder if you have any imagination. It's very fascinating to talk to people with no imagination. At least they say they have none. The only time they have it's when they're looking at the television set. When they watch their soap operas, they live every moment, but they pretend not to have imagination when they pick up the Word of God, the Bible. Use your imagination, will you? A young shepherd boy, and picture his dress. And Goliath. Goliath, on the one hand, is described here, and I read it to you. 9 feet tall, an incredible giant of a man, not unusual in those days. With his helmet on, he had a spear like a beaver's weem. And here's Goliath stepping out to meet him. And there's David, dressed in his shepherd's clothing, carrying a staff and a sling, chose 5 round stones from a brook, and put them in his little pouch, and off he went. The contrast comes in their comments. Let's listen to Goliath. Verse 43 and 44. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" The Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." By the way, that didn't faze David one bit. And so he replies in verse 45. David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with the sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Almighty God, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. Today I'll give your carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those who gathered here will know that it's not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." You know, I wish we'd remember that. When you get involved in the problems of life, the battle is the Lord's, not yours, and he will carry you through them. It's when we try to do it ourselves that we get into problems. But notice the contrast of the confidence in these two men. The Philistine, just by his physical stature, had all his confidence in his size and in his weapons. David had all his confidence totally in the living God. It must have been a fascinating scene, and with a little imagination you can see these two standing against one another, some little distance apart. And it must have been almost humorous to look at them. I doubt very much if all the army could have heard what was said, but if they did hear what was said, they'd have heard that contrast in the challenge. So far as Goliath was concerned, he was the man of the day, and this young kid was just about to be killed. As far as David was concerned, that wasn't in. He had the power of the living God, and he was about to exercise it, and he was to do so with strength and with might, because he knew the living God. Now, in all this, I believe there are lessons for us. And I believe that's why the Old Testament can be so valuable. I believe it speaks to us. First of all, let's look together at some of these lessons. Look at everything in your life and every experience you have through the eyes of faith. This was the key that David had. When he heard that Philistine, when he saw him, he did not see the size of that man. He simply saw a man defying God. And that's what he wanted to deal with. I don't think for a moment he was the least bit concerned with Goliath as an individual. He was concerned at what he was saying about the Lord his God. Look at life through the eyes of faith. Secondly, notice nothing was impossible to David because he knew God. And nothing is impossible for you and for me when we know God. It's when we're trying to do it ourselves and on our own that we get into problems. And along with that, David teaches us another lesson. David knew that in every situation he was a majority because God was with him. That's just as true for you and me. You might have a difficult situation ahead of you today, a difficult interview, someone you have to talk to you that you don't really want to. Maybe you've got to deal with a bully. I have particular problems with bullies. Notice, will you, that into each situation that you can step in as a majority when God is with you. Fix your eyes on the Lord and not on the problem. David didn't really see Goliath. He saw God and something in the way. Fix your eyes on the Lord at all times, and look to the Lord for everything. The big things of daily life and the small issues. Make it a daily dependence. In the Lord's Prayer we say, "Give us this day our daily bread." That's a biblical principle, and every one of us should learn it. Moment by moment become dependent on the Lord your God, and your life will begin to change. You see, David had skills, David had talents, and he committed them to God, and that made all the difference in his life.